No.
Welcome to the event this evening, a Hustings event for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch. My name is Forsyth and I'm your chair for this evening. Dingwall and Free Church is pleased to host this evening's event as a service to our community. As a Christian church, we believe in respect for the civil government and pray for the PM and FM, irrespective of their political colours. However, tonight is your event. All the questions for the panel will come from you, the public. Subject to the number of questions, we expect the event to last between an hour and 90 minutes. We'll certainly finish no later than 9 o'clock. And what a time we're having in Scottish politics. There's not been a year like it since the first meeting of the new Parliament took place in May 1999. So irrespective of your political views, I'm sure that we can all agree that this election matters. For questions, in a moment I'll introduce the panel, but first a word on how to submit questions. We're going to submit and manage questions using Pigeonhole. If you don't already have the link to Pigeonhole, it appears on your screen now. So if you click through that link, you can submit a question. You can submit a question with your name or anonymously. And if you like a question that someone else has submitted, you can vote for it by clicking on the triangle on the left-hand side of the question. So we have a number of questions that have already been submitted during the day, and people have voted for them. So the questions are not my questions. I'm not going to put any questions to the panel tonight. They all come from you. The plan is to ask the most popular questions. Having said that, I'd like to ensure that we cover a variety of topics. I'm sure we'll discuss the Constitution, but I would like to discuss the economy, education, health, justice, housing, and transport. So I'd like to have a range of topics. So please do submit questions at any point. If we don't have any questions, we don't have an event. I'd also encourage you to ask the difficult questions that you have on your mind. Tonight's an opportunity to get answers, and by asking the tough questions that you have on your mind, you're enabling the candidates to demonstrate their qualities and their politics. So if I could introduce you to the panel, I'm pleased to welcome Denis Rixson from Scottish Liberal Democrats, Jamie Halcro Johnston from the Scottish Conservative Party, John Erskine from the Scottish Labour Party, and Kate Forbes from the Scottish National Party. So each candidate will give a 5-minute opening statement. And as this is a virtual event, we can police the timing very effectively. So the sound will be switched off after 5 minutes. Before this evening's event, I met with the candidates and we drew the names from a hat to determine the running order for the opening statements. So we're going to have Jamie, John, Kate, and then Denis. So once again, before I hand over to the candidates for their opening statements, please do submit questions through Pigeonhole. So Jamie, if I could hand over to you to hear your opening statement, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Donald, and thank you for the invite to this evening's hustings. I'm Jamie Halcro Johnston, and I'm the Scottish Conservative and Unionist candidate for the seat. I probably won't use my full 5 minutes. I know time is tight, and I'm very interested to hear some of the issues that matter to the audience. But I would like to highlight a few key areas where I'm sure we'd all agree action needs to be taken, and to lay out how we, the Scottish Conservatives, hope to do that. Across Scotland, communities have suffered because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's particularly true here in the Highlands and Islands. And so we've looked at a number of key areas where we think Scotland needs support and we need to focus our attentions. So in transport, the Scottish Conservatives will invest in upgrading local roads, dealing with local potholes, including accelerating the upgrading of the A9 and constructing a bypass for the Rixson Be Thankful. We'd also work to decarbonise the transport sector, expanding the building of infrastructure like electric vehicle charging points, and we'd dual the Highland Main Line to Inverness, expanding capacity for the whole region. On broadband, to connect Scotland virtually, we'd ensure every home and business premise in Scotland has a full fibre connection by the end of 2027, starting with areas the SNP has left behind, like the Highlands and Islands. On housing, a particular issue in a lot of parts of this constituency, and again across the Highlands and Islands and across Scotland, we deliver 60,000 new affordable homes across Scotland, of which 2/3 would be for social rent. And we'd invest 50 million through the Rural Housing Fund to support building and renovations in remote and rural areas like ours. And we'll end rough sleeping by 2026, one of Scotland's shames. On education, recognising the impact of the pandemic, again, we'd launch a rural teacher fund as part of our 550 million teacher workforce strategy. We'd recruit 3,000 more teachers across Scotland and introduce a £500 skills grant for everyone to help with retraining. And agriculture would end the uncertainty for our farmers by launching a full public consultation on a blueprint for Scotland's new agricultural policy within 100 days of the election. And we'd support farm diversification and support efforts to crack down on rural crime. And we'd invest in our rural communities and our coastal communities. For our businesses, the Scottish Conservatives plan for a 25% business rates reduction for hospitality and leisure sector in 2022-2023, an area so badly impacted by COVID closures and restrictions. And we'd introduce a review of the business rate system by the end of the Parliament session in 2026. And we'd repeal the SNP's pernicious hate crime bill. In health, recognise the impact of the pandemic on our health service. We'd increase funding by 2 billion and provide a further 600 million to help our health sector catch up after delays and reduced services. And with Scotland's appalling record on drugs deaths, we'd introduce a right to rehab, giving those suffering from addiction the right to access residential drugs rehabilitation services. Nicola Sturgeon admitted recently that she took her eye off the ball on drugs deaths. And this is a point I'll finish on. We can deliver all of the above. We can take head on some of the challenges Scotland faces, but we can't do that when the focus of government is on agitating for another divisive independence referendum. So the Scottish Conservatives oppose another referendum. We believe Scotland needs to come together, to work together, and to focus on Scotland's recovery and rebuilding our country. Thank you for listening.
Jamie, thank you very much for that. John, if I could now hand over to you, please, for your opening statement.
Yes, good evening, and thank you to Donald and others for organising this evening's hustings. I was pleased to be out in Kiltarlity earlier today to undertake some canvassing, and I'm very much looking forward to tonight's discussion. But like Jamie, I doubt I'll use my full 5 minutes in opening here. I'm John Erskine, and I'm Scottish Labour's candidate for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, and I'm also standing for Scottish Labour on the Highlands and Islands regional list. I was also recently appointed as Scottish Labour spokesperson for energy, connectivity and the islands. The last year has been tough for everyone living in the Highlands and Islands. The pandemic has separated us from our friends and family, and despite that, we've come together like never before. I don't think we can now come through the collective challenge of COVID and go back to the old arguments, arguing with each other while our NHS loses funding, our young people miss out on a world-class education, and businesses see jobs going overseas. Instead, Scottish Labour, under the leadership of Anna Sarwar, want to focus on what unites us together, not what divides us, focusing on uniting our people and rebuilding Scotland. That's why this election must be about delivering a national recovery plan that at its heart is about creating jobs, catching up on education, rebuilding our NHS, and tackling the climate emergency. The whole of Scotland faces challenges as we recover from the pandemic, and these challenges are acutely felt in the Highlands. With a lack of decent, well-paying jobs for our young people, a lack of affordable housing, underinvestment in public transport and digital connectivity, these are all compounded by the centralisation of powers away from our communities to Edinburgh and elsewhere. So Scottish Labour has a Highlands and Islands recovery plan that will focus on a jobs recovery, guaranteeing a job for every young person in the Highlands and Islands by investing in a national fund and a business restart fund. An NHS recovery, funding our NHS to get cancer diagnosis and care back on course, improving mental health and giving carers the pay they deserve. An education recovery, developing a catch-up plan which invests in schools and ensures our pupils get the support they need to make up for lost learning. A climate recovery plan, investing in green jobs and seizing Scotland's hosting of COP26 to champion an ambitious climate justice plan. And a community recovery plan to create a community recovery fund to invest in our local areas and make our communities safer and more resilient. We can't rely on the SNP to focus on the recovery when they've already set out plans for a second independence referendum. And we can't expect Boris Johnson's Tories to deliver a recovery that works for us all. Only by using both votes for Scottish Labour can people living in Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch ensure we deliver a parliament that focuses on what our families and our communities in the Highlands and Islands need. A plan for change, not more of the same. Thank you.
John, thank you very much for that. And again, if I could just encourage people to keep submitting questions through Pigeonhole. We have a number of questions so far, from gender issues, transport, constitution, economy, education. So please keep those questions coming in, and please do vote for questions that you'd like to be asked. Kate, if I could now hand over to you, please.
Well, thanks very much, Faith Gurma. It's great to be able to join you. A lot hangs on this election, and I think, whilst we have been through a very difficult year, and for many of us, politics will be the last thing on our minds, it should be proper to have an election at this time, because governments should be held to account, and politicians should be scrutinised and held accountable, particularly after a year like the year that we have had. We've all been through a difficult and in some cases heartbreaking year, particularly in the Highlands, where, as somebody who represented Skye when there was the COVID outbreak in the care home there, I know that whilst COVID has sometimes felt far away, it has other times come too close to home. And for those of us that perhaps haven't been touched directly by COVID, there have been plenty of times of hopelessness, lots of worry, lots of frustration, I'm sure, and a sense of fatigue as well. And during that time, leadership has mattered. It's mattered over the last year. And leadership to make difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions, leadership to accept when things haven't gone as well as it could. And leadership will also matter more than ever over the next few years when it comes to our recovery. And our country is in much need of recovery. I think we'll hear a lot about recovery tonight. Economic recovery in terms of getting businesses open, saving jobs. Social recovery in terms of allowing us to relate to one another as we were created to relate to one another. And, dare I say it, because this is a church's husting, spiritual recovery as well, in allowing churches and public worship to get back to normal without restrictions and offering hope to those who are struggling. There is much to be hopeful about in terms of vaccinations remaining on track, lockdown restrictions are being lifted, but we need that vision for recovery, and I've set out 3 areas. My commitment as a local representative is to tackle the local and the national challenges that we face in the same way as I've tackled challenges over the last few years, listening first, being accountable to the electorate, and then working with you through the ups and the downs to get problems fixed. I'd like to touch just briefly on 3 priorities as I see it for the next few years. Firstly, on health and social care. The pandemic has certainly revealed just how important our health service is, but it's also created a backlog of cases that need to be resolved. And so our commitment is to increase NHS funding by at least 20% to remobilise our NHS. There have also been big questions about how our elderly and vulnerable citizens are cared for and how we as a society put value on their lives. And that's why we will also create a national care service backed by increasing investment in social care by 25%. Secondly, on our economy, we need to invest in infrastructure to create jobs. And we've committed to delivering another 100,000 more affordable homes on top of the 97,000 that have been delivered since 2007. That creates a pipeline of jobs and of apprenticeships, but it also increases the supply of housing in the Highlands. Thirdly and lastly, on poverty and inequalities. Although unemployment has remained relatively stable, particularly in the last few months, the claimant count for welfare support has increased substantially, showing that people are in need. More children are in poverty, and it's never a child's fault to be in poverty. People have lost their jobs. And so we'll double the Scottish Child Payment to tackle child poverty and boost family incomes, which is one of the very few welfare powers that we have. I said that this election was about leadership, but it's also about who gets to decide our future. Should it be politicians dictating that future, or should it be a question that we put to the people of Scotland? And ultimately, I want to see a recovery that is made in Scotland, that's shaped in Scotland, a recovery where the people of Scotland have a say over their own future. And so that also has a bearing on this election. So as I finish, just under 5 minutes, it's been a privilege to serve the people of Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch over the last 5 years, through difficult times and through good times. The last year in particular has been difficult. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. With that tunnel comes choices, and hopefully this Hustings tonight will bring some of those choices and the answers that we need to light. Thanks, Donald.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And if I can now hand over to Denis.
Thank you, Donald, and thank you very much for the invitation for this evening. I'm Denis Rixson, and I'm an ex-school teacher and spent over 30 years teaching in both primary and secondary in Highland. For many years, I owned a bookshop in Mallaig and in Glasgow, which gave me business experience. We used to specialise in Highland material, which matches with my passion for Highland history. And I'm currently a Highland councillor for the Coolwood Mallaig ward and serve on a number of committees, including the Climate Change Working Group. So what do I and my party stand for? We put recovery first, not NDREF 2. The economy in large parts of Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch have been devastated. The tourist, retail and hospitality industries are on their knees, and that affects everyone. What troubles the West Coast and Speyside will have knock-on effects in Inverness and elsewhere. Our economy reopens from next week, and businesses, both urban and rural, will need our support. We believe in federalism and a four-nation UK. We don't like centralism and uniformity. Liberal Democrats believe in devolving power downwards, not just to Edinburgh or even Inverness, but down to local communities wherever possible. Local decision making usually means that those decisions reflect local circumstances and local needs. We do not believe the middle of a pandemic is a time for NDREF 2, which is what you may get if electors return an SNP/Green government to Holyrood, conceivably with support from Alba. We feel there are great strengths from being part of the United Kingdom. In terms of the pandemic, you can see that with our vaccination rollout. In terms of genomic sequencing, which allows us to detect and track COVID variants, our UK-wide medical networks have set benchmarks for the rest of the world. Liberal Democrats believe that recovery should be green. What can we do? Well, we need to support our public transport system. Of course, I'm in favour of active travel by foot and bike, but I recognise that in our climate, that's not always practical. So we need to get as many as possible out of their cars and into buses. Subsidised buses, frequent buses. Green recovery should involve supporting renewables, offshore wind farms, hydro schemes where feasible, hydrogen-fuelled buses and possibly hydrogen-fuelled trains. We should encourage local food production where possible. We save food miles and support those people who work the land. And then there's housing. The one thing we hear time and again throughout the constituency is the need to enhance rural housing so that young people can afford to stay here. The pandemic has paused some of the larger economic forces which encourage globalization. Many of us now shop locally or online. Small local shops have often had a bit of a lift. Can we encourage that trend so that more people produce and consume locally? There are undoubted environmental advantages. Achieving our climate change targets also means modifying our behaviour. The pandemic has helped work some of those changes. Many of us spend more time working remotely now. We hope the new normal will accommodate the best of those changes. We can rethink how we work so that few of us have to commute into town or city offices. Not everybody can adapt their work patterns, but enough can to bring real benefits to society. The Highlands have fared better than many parts of Scotland during the pandemic, but our economy needs to recover, and Liberals favour small and local rather than big and central. We favour diversity, not one size fits all. We want to tackle our climate change agenda by encouraging tree planting, district heating systems, domestic heating systems that don't depend on fossil fuels, and more electric or hydrogen fuel vehicles. The present Scottish Government does not have a good record on business or education. Think Ferguson Shipyard, Bifab, Prestwick Airport. Huge wastage of public money, ships not built, objectives not achieved. We also want to restore our education system to the international status it once enjoyed. The 2018 PISA results showed Scotland behind England in all three categories. We think it's time for a change. Thank you.
Denis, thank you very much for that. Stephen, could we put the link to Pigeonhole up one more time, please? So yes, again, if you haven't logged into Pigeonhole yet, this is the platform that we're using tonight to gather questions. So if you click on that link, you can access Pigeonhole. You can enter a question, you can put your name on it, you can enter it anonymously, and you can also vote for questions that others have submitted by clicking on the small triangle on the left-hand side. So we have a good number of questions in. We have 26 questions in so far. I'm going to ask the questions that receive the most votes. Seems very democratic. And so it's entirely your agenda tonight. The questions that you ask, the questions that you get, that you vote for will be asked. So there are 4 questions at the top of the league, which are all around kind of health, family, gender issues. So let's start with these. So the top question so far, as it seems likely there will be a discussion in the coming Scottish Parliament about euthanasia and assisted suicide. Do you agree? What's your view on euthanasia and assisted suicide? Maybe we can ask Jamie to speak first on this.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me. It's a very good but a very difficult question, and I hope that people will feel that my answer is honest and very much, and it will be actually very personal. When I've previously, some time ago, worked as an advisor at Parliament, many years ago now, when the first planned assisted dying bill was brought through by, I think, Jeremy Purvis. And then, of course, Margaret MacDonald, who herself was ill, I think brought through or tried to introduce another bill as well. And my opinion back then was that there was far too many questions about, far too many issues around potential safeguards and the lack of safeguards. And I was, as an advisor, not an MSP, extremely, I found it very difficult to support any aspect of it. I have to say that over the last few years, as someone who has, unfortunately, as we all probably have, lost friends and seen friends who've had serious illnesses deteriorating, I'm not saying it's changed my position to one of support, but it's certainly changed my position to one of being more ready to listen to the arguments. I still have a lot of concerns about the safeguards being put forward or being proposed by some of the campaigns, or some of those still campaigning for it. But it would be wrong of me to say that I'm now fundamentally as opposed as I was before. I think when you have seen people that you care about go through some of the things that, unfortunately, people who are very ill go through, and you've seen their deteriorating situation, I think it would be difficult to find a situation where you are fundamentally opposed to something that unfortunately a couple of them wanted. They wanted the ability to end their own life. Now, as I say, that isn't support, but it certainly leaves me in a more open-minded position to listening to some of the arguments. But I still have concerns about some of the safeguards that are absolutely vital to make sure there isn't exploitation or things go wrong with any system. But as I say, I'm sure it will be introduced into the next Parliament, and I think it's one that we'll all have to look at very, very closely.
Thanks, Jay. Kate, would you like to come in next?
Yes, I will, thanks. I think it is probably one of the most pertinent questions of the next Parliament. I have an answer to that question, but I do also want to acknowledge that most people who contact me wanting to see a change on the law do so from having lived through severe pain or severe anguish. And these issues need to be dealt with in a very caring and compassionate way. However, having looked in some depth at the provision of assisted suicide where it has been legalised, particularly in the Netherlands and in Oregon, to name just two areas, I wouldn't support the provision of assisted suicide. And I don't think that we can ever get to a position where there are sufficient safeguards to protect people who might face pressure to go through with that, even if it's not from close family, friends or clinicians, the pressure themselves, knowing that that is an option. So from that perspective, my answer would be quite clear cut. That's not to say that I'm not open to discussing it with people, because I want to understand their lived experience. But from my perspective, I think that life is precious, and I would far rather see us fundamentally increase our investment in palliative care, ensuring that we have the higher standards in the world when it comes to hospice provision or in social care. So that would be my position. But I say that knowing that nobody comes at this debate and this discussion without a sense of compassion. But I could not see a way in which the law would sufficiently protect people from feeling under pressure. And I think nobody should feel under pressure, particularly in the Highlands where we do, it's a different issue. But in the Highlands, our suicide rate already is far too high. It's a fundamentally different issue. But I think we need to be providing greater levels of care rather than opening that door.
Thanks, Kate. John, could I hand over to you for your comments, please?
Yeah, thanks, Donald. You know, this is an incredibly emotive issue, and I'm sure, like the other candidates, would agree, my inbox has been flooded by campaigners on both sides of this debate. And I take the time to look at every single one of those emails and hear the concerns of people that support assisted dying and those that are opposed to it for a whole variety of reasons. And I perhaps come at it from a slightly different angle than Jamie. I was also working in Parliament as an advisor when this came in front of Parliament last time. And I initially was very supportive of the proposals. But having watched the parliamentary debate and having seen the arguments about safeguarding, it did temper my view on the issue. And I did become more and more concerned about the appropriate safeguarding measures that could be put in place. And I was particularly concerned about how some people, disabled people, elderly people, might feel pressured into taking a decision. So I certainly tempered my view on this, and I'm still open to persuasion from both sides of the argument. I'm not convinced that we couldn't find a way to safeguard people and introduce assisted dying to tackle some of these horrendous deaths that I read about in these emails that people send me, often very, very harrowing, and not at all how we should have end-of-life care in the 21st century. So I'm sure it will come in front of Parliament next time. I hope the Parliament considers it as carefully as they did previously. And I think many members elected in the next session will have to look at this extremely, extremely carefully and really go into detail about the facts on both sides of the case, because there's compelling arguments on both sides. And as I say, I've certainly tempered my view on this and want to make sure that we can get this absolutely right. But listening to the many people that emailed me, it's a very, very difficult issue. So open to persuasion, but I'm certainly open-minded to the proposals.
Thanks, Sean. And Denis, if we could have your views, please.
Can you hear me all right? Yes, thank you. I'm a Liberal, so you'll understand that my sort of political philosophy is always based around freedom and the aspirations for freedom and so on. And I have always been concerned of the freedom of the individual against the requirements of the state. That informs my views on lots of things like sexuality. It informs my views on issues such as this. Although I do respect that those people who particularly come from a religious background, a variety of different religions, have very strong views on this issue. But I tend to view it in terms of the freedom of the individual to live their lives the way they wish to. I myself have what's known as an advance directive. I gave it to my doctor many, many years ago. Essentially, it's what's called a living will in England. It's an advance directive to your doctor telling him or her what to do in the event of you having some sort of terminal condition and so on. Now, in terms of the question that was asked tonight, I have no time for euthanasia. I don't think that's up for discussion at all. I think the critical issue here is the business about assisted dying or assisted suicide. Now, I do take the point that Kate has made, and it's a very real one, about the pressure being felt by any individual to conform to what they feel others might want them to do. I do understand that pressure, but equally well, it's brought to bear on those people who at the moment are seeking relief from what they feel terrible, debilitating and life-threatening conditions, and who wish to exercise some judgment over their own future. There are real issues about safeguarding. I wouldn't try and minimize those in the slightest. I think we absolutely have to come up with rigorous safeguards, so there's never any question of anybody feeling that whatever decision they come to can't be reversed at every stage of the process, that other people are scrutinizing it, that there really is a rigorous process that you have to go through. But fundamentally, I don't want anybody else to tell me how I can live my life, or at the end, if I so require, help me in being able to end it. And I feel that that freedom which I want for myself should be available for others as well. After a thorough debate in Parliament, and I perfectly recognise that other people with very strong views may oppose mine, and they may even persuade me that mine is not really a tenable position at the moment. But that is my position just now. That's what I feel at the minute. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks for that. So the next most popular question is, what is your party's definition of a woman? So I suppose whilst that's the question that's been submitted, I think that's probably shorthand for a bigger question about gender identity, the ability to self-identify gender, etc. So what's your party's definition of a woman? Clearly a question set within gender identity. So John, could I maybe ask you to start with this?
Thanks, Donald. This is another issue that's top of the inbox for me. I've been getting a lot of correspondence from both sides of the debate on this issue as well. First and foremost, I would describe myself as an LGBT ally. So for me, fundamentally, trans women are women. And I would set that out first and foremost. I think there has been a lot of scaremongering and a lot of stoking up of division around this debate. And I think what we need to do is really take a step back and approach it with caution. There's been concerns over the Gender Recognition Act, the ability of people to self-identify. But I think what we need to do is look at it in the wider context of human rights and women's rights. And I'm of course aware of the concerns about the encroachment and the infringement on women's spaces. And again, I think this is something that the Parliament will certainly consider in the next session. And again, it's something we need to be very careful about legislating, because I do think there is a position where we can get things correct and we can make sure that trans women, their rights are protected, but we also protect women's space and they don't feel that they are being attacked in any way, shape or form. So, I think there's intense lobbying going on both sides of the debate here, but what we need to do is make sure it's a reasoned debate and we come up with solutions that work for everyone. So first and foremost, we have to get this right in the next Parliament. We can't rush into legislation. So, I hope that sets out my position on the matter. Clearly a very strong supporter of LGBT rights, and I do think we need to make progress in the next Parliament. but I do want to be very cautious about it and make sure that we do it in a safe and secure way.
Thanks, Sean. Jamie, could we get your views, please?
Yes, you're certainly not holding back on the difficult and emotive topics, I think, this evening, and I think that's absolutely right. This has become an extremely polarised debate. I mean, I had representation, again, from both sides as an MSP over the last 4 years. And my fundamental position with pretty much anything, actually, as a Conservative, I don't believe state or others should infringe on the rights of individuals to live their lives as they see fit, whether we agree or disagree with that. However, there is always an issue where perhaps the sought after rights of one group infringe on the rights of others. And I think there's real concern, and obviously I'm not a woman, but I know certainly a lot of my colleagues and my female friends feel that some of their identity and their rights are being impacted or being affected by some of the rights being called for different groups. And obviously that's an area of real concern for everybody. And there are practical issues as well. I mean, I know some of these are very extreme examples, but there have been concerns raised by parents about access to facilities and the like. You know, with a lot of these things, there's a solution, but other areas, I think there's going to be a huge amount of work needing to be done. If, for example, the plans as been initially put forward to are taken forward. We haven't really started to have that full debate yet in Parliament because, you know, it has become so polarised. It's become something I think Parliament and the government have rather pulled back from in terms of having a full debate. You've seen issues within the Scottish Green and the Scottish National Party, particularly, where different opinions are being held by different individuals. It is going to be an extremely difficult debate when it happens. It is going to be one where there are, I think, very unpleasant things, or continue to be unpleasant things to be said by both groups. But I really do have concerns that once we get into this debate, it's not going to be one that can be had with a sense of intelligence or honesty or openness or transparency. It's one that's going to be pretty unpleasant. And but I think that's something that obviously is going to be coming up in the next Parliament.
Thanks, Jamie. Denis, could we get your views, please?
Thanks. Following on from the last question, I think my sort of liberal approach is that essentially the state should have nothing to do with how you choose to live your private life. So on all questions of how you wish to identify and everything else, the state should take nothing to do with that. Where it becomes trickier, it's not so much about your private life, but when your private life goes into public spaces, then it's become more difficult. And I do know that at the time of the last election, there was considerable debate about retaining safe spaces for women if they so required them. And we have to recognize that some women do feel extremely vulnerable. And in particular, things like women's aid shelters and so on. And we have to take those fears and that feeling of vulnerability into account. Now, what tends to happen these days is it tends to come down as a sort of competitive tussle between rights, the rights of women perhaps to have those safe spaces to themselves and the rights of somebody else to declare themselves whatever they wish to do. And I think that when it comes down to an issue of rights, sometimes the temperature seems to rise exponentially. And as in many other issues of rights, I think we have to see if we can't reach some compromise solutions that recognizes that sometimes there are going to be areas of tension and difficulty, but can't we work to resolve those that gives most people most of what they want most of the time? I have listened to some of the debate that's gone on in recent years, some of the online debate. I know one of our prominent authors has got closely involved in this. And as a man who doesn't know everything about this issue, I sometimes step back absolutely horrified at the temperature and the ferocity with which this debate is conducted. And I think to myself, surely can't we put our heads together and see if we can't come up with living, workable compromises that don't require anybody to give up their fiercely held beliefs, but equally well allow us to live together and find a sort of compromise solution at a practical level. And that's my wish. I don't know how unrealistic it is. Thanks, Donald.
Thanks. Yeah, so if I could just ask, in terms of protecting women's spaces, for instance, in sport, how would you deal with the ability for someone to identify as a woman and compete in a women's sport, which then gave them an unfair advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tricky one, and it's not as if this isn't being tackled already. We've had the case of a South African athlete, and all sorts of questions have been swirling round. I think that I would try and remove personalities from this in as much as possible. Now, it must be feasible to come up with formulae, because after all, it does happen in the Paralympics. There are umpteen degrees of disability, all of which are sort of regulated and adhered to by the different athletes. I do understand the principle that if you are a man who identifies as a woman, you may be fitter and stronger and all the rest of it, or run faster, and this is an issue that has to be tackled. I don't actually feel able to legislate for a sporting body on that one, and I would hope that they would come up after much internal discussion with all the groups involved with workable compromises. And it may be that in the future we don't just have men and women races or boys and girls races. I could see other formulae being developed. But my feeling is, can't we come to some working compromises rather than the all or nothing, my stance or your stance option? Thanks, Donald.
Okay. Thanks, Jansen. Kate, if we could now hear your views, please.
Yeah, thanks. When you first asked the question about what is a woman, I thought I was probably the only one as the resident expert and the sole female up on the panel to be able to answer that with this slight advantage when it comes to the question, because I am a woman, as are my mum and sisters and others. If I approach this, let me just 3 principles. 1, I believe in the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. And secondly, I would agree with Denis that this debate has become extremely polarised and unpleasant, with individuals caught up in the middle of the crossfire, labels getting thrown about to shut down the debate. And I would agree that the heat and the vitriol is quite remarkable in this debate. Now, that should not be a reason not to have the debate. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying as though that means that we avoid the debate. I am on record as saying that these are very, very weighty matters and we need to weigh them up before any decisions are made. There have been fears expressed about women's rights and women's spaces. As a woman, I get it. I understand those fears and concerns. And I think, going back to that point around the nature of the debate, everybody has the right to express their views and nobody should be shut down. And I think that's an important point in this debate where there has been a lot of shutting down of views. So I don't think concerns should be dismissed. I think they need to be considered. In terms of schools and education, I think that there are particular issues there. And I do wholeheartedly believe that parents need to be involved with decisions that are being made in schools in particular. In terms of the wider issue on legislation, there have been 2 consultations. There has been no legislation. There have been 2 consultations. I am on record over the last few years in terms of indicating how weighty these things are, how much consultation there should be, and how much protection should be put in place when it comes to some of the concerns that have been raised.
Great, thanks. Would any of the other candidates like to comment on the subsidiary question asked about sport? I don't feel obliged to, but if you'd like to come back on that point.
I mean, I'm happy to come in on that, Donald, if you want to. I mean, the first thing I would say as somebody that's been involved in sport and I'm trying to encourage more women to get involved in sport over the years, I think that is an issue. But actually, there's far more important areas that need to be covered. I mean, I think we've seen this week calls for people that may be involved in rape cases being allowed to self-identify as women. I think that's a area of concern, and of course there's other concerns around, as we talked. I think Denis talked about shared spaces. It is such a sensitive issue. There are clearly going to be areas where there is huge, I suppose, confrontation in the debate and confrontation of rights. And I just hope the debate as it develops over the next, or as it comes back to Parliament, can be had in a calmer way. Because I think all of us on the panel agree that the temperature has been extremely high, and what we need to see is a little bit more respect for other opinions, but also an understanding of some of the real implications of what's being suggested and proposed.
Great, thanks, Jimmy. Okay, there are two more questions in this general area of family, gender, health, which have received a lot of votes. So I feel compelled to ask these two further questions, and then we'll move on to other areas. We do have lots of questions about the EU and transport and the economy. So another question which received a lot of votes is, do candidates want to continue with the current policy allowing early medical abortion at home in Scotland without a face-to-face meeting with a doctor or a nurse? Denis, could I ask you to come in on that first, please?
Thank you. I'm not quite sure of the background to this. I imagine it's presumably to do with the taking of some sort of medication or pill at home to encourage an abortion. I think my feeling about all of this is that it's much better to do things in a medical environment than to do things at home. Some of us are old enough to remember the situation prior to the Abortion Act, and the number of young women with their babies who died because of backstreet abortions in the old days. I am a little bit wary of such major steps being undertaken at home. I think that whilst I'm all for people exercising freedom to the maximum, I tend to think that things which could gravely affect the health and the mental health of a young woman should be, how shall I say, should be conducted with people who've had experience in guiding other young women through the process, who know who to refer these young women to if they wish to seek further guidance and support, who can talk to them about all the things that they might not have considered. Now, of course, the really difficult situation here is that the first person you would want, or the first people you want any young woman to talk to is their family. But of course, I recognize that in the real world, that's not always possible, sometimes not even desirable. So there are professionals out there to help troubled young people who are in difficult situations. And I think my feeling would be, it would always be better to have professional advice and do something in a professional context, a proper medical environment, rather than to have things done at home. But I also appreciate that there are issues of freedom. And of course, the other thing is, not everybody lives in an ideal home environment. Some of them live in extremely stressful and difficult circumstances. Thank you, Donald.
Thanks, Denis. John, would you like to come in next, please?
Thanks, Donald. And again, this is obviously a very weighty and serious issue that we're focusing on just now. I would agree with much of what Denis has said, but I do think, all these decisions around abortion and access to it does need to be led by the science and does need to be led by medical advice. I'm not a doctor, but I'm sure that the medical evidence shows that it can be done safely at home. You're looking at access. I mean, we live in a rural area, the Highlands and Islands. Many people don't have access to facilities on their doorstep, and that can certainly be an issue in accessing medical support. And it might actually be easier for people to access abortion at home if, for example, they had to travel long distances, stay overnight. So I think there's certainly serious concerns around how safe that would be for someone to do themselves, or without support if they didn't have family support. So I don't know all the details on this, but certainly I'm sure that it has been found to be safe and effective at home with the right medical support and guidance backing that up. So I would like to see a continuation of what currently exists, but I do think we need a wraparound service to make sure that women are getting the support they need, both before, when making this decision, and afterwards as well. And we've seen cuts to NHS Highland and services right across the patch. So I do have concerns about what support and level of support is on offer to them. So that's why we fundamentally need to reinvest in our health service, and that'll play a key part in our election message about rebuilding our NHS and making sure communities and all those living in them have decent access to health services where they need them in any part of the Highlands and Islands.
Thanks very much, John. Kate, could we hear you next, please?
Sure. So the caveat to everything that I'm just about to say is that in all of these situations, my view would be that I strongly believe that the mothers and the babies' lives matter in these situations. So both lives matter in those situations. And that's, irrespective of at what stage in a pregnancy, irrespective of where a termination or an abortion happens, that both lives matter in those situations. In terms of the specifics, concerns have been expressed, as Denis outlined, in terms of what support there would be for a woman in that situation, in terms of the checks, the potential for being missold, drugs and otherwise in that situation. And irrespective of what any of us think about the rights and wrongs of abortion, it is a traumatic experience, and therefore making sure that there is the mental, emotional and physical support for a woman in that situation, and that she has been offered all support in terms of alternatives in advance of making that decision, I think is really important. And that's why I think that there should be maximum access to health services in those situations. So that's a specific answer to your question, but I go back to where I started, which I think that both lives matter in that scenario.
That's good. Jamie, if we could get your views, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, it's an area, I'm sure Kate's had the same, that I've had a considerable amount of correspondence on in the past. I actually wrote to the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Jean Freeman, to raise some of the concerns that I had with it. I mean, we can all understand why perhaps it was introduced, because of the need to reduce the number of people visiting. But I think, as Kate pointed out, what we need to is that people are getting the right support and the right advice that they need. I suppose in that letter to Jean Freeman, one of the issues that I raised was to make sure that we got back to normal service as soon as possible. And I know that's obviously something we would probably all look to in terms of this and other health areas. But what I wanted to make sure didn't happen was that this became a kind of permanent fixture. And I do have concerns that perhaps that's being looked at. And I would have further concerns if the Scottish Government really did make remote consultations on something which was more the norm, rather than something that was happening because of the exceptional situation that we all faced with COVID. So, as I say, I have concerns. I have raised those with the Cabinet Secretary for Health.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And then our final question in this space is about childcare. So the SNP offer, I'm told, 1,140 hours of childcare. Instead of offering the childcare, why not give the cash to the parents so they have the freedom to pay for childcare? Why not give parents a choice? Kate, if we could start with you, please, on that.
Yeah, so a question about child benefit is a legitimate one. Obviously, we don't have powers over child benefits, so it would be setting up something separate, standalone in terms of providing support. We actually are doing that in a different way, but it is It's not a universal benefit. It is a targeted benefit. I talked in my opening remarks about the Scottish Child Payment, which is a payment directly to families to help them with the financial costs. So in a sense, we are already doing that to an extent, and the 1140 hours is separate to that. So, you know, I mean, I'm not averse to the proposal, I suppose is what I'm saying, but there is already established a separate means of reaching families, but it's only if their income is below a certain level, with the understanding that where a family can afford to care for their children, they won't need that additional financial payment from the state. And quite separately to that is the 1140 hours rollout. So not averse to it. I think something like that happens to an extent right now. It's just not universal.
Okay, thanks for that. Kate, that was a very specific question about SNP current policy. Would any of the other candidates like to come in to say what they would do, how they would help children, how they would help families with young children? Jamie?
Yeah.
Sorry, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I really wanted to kind of clarify was that we keep getting told that, you know, the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to do this. It does. The Scottish Government can set up new benefits. That's you know, where they want to. And so if this was something that the SNP wanted to deliver, they would do. Just really because it was a question about 1140 hours as well, and whether it was better to say simply provide them. Even with the 1140 hours, I was a shadow education minister, and that covered obviously young people as well. This policy wasn't going to be met when it was withdrawn. Now, we all recognise that the implications of COVID, we all recognise that will have had effect on all of our education and childcare services, but it simply wasn't going to be delivered because there wasn't the capacity out there. So I know it's been reintroduced. There's now a new target date. Let's see if this original pledge gets met for the second time or not, because I think there's a lot of parents out there that may be a little sceptical.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Denis, you'd like to come in.
Thanks so much, Donald. It will not surprise you as an ex-school teacher that I'm interested in anything to do with caring for children. I mean, I welcome the 1140 hours. I'm all in favour of providing as much as we can for young children. I do recognise that there's been huge change between the generations. I mean, when I was a child, which was a very long time ago, very little of this was about. And even when my children were young, very little of this was about. We're moving to a world now where a far greater number of young women are in work or going back to work quite quickly after giving birth. And I don't quarrel with that in the slightest. I think it's great. But equally well, we as a society have to move to provide things for those families where they may be struggling with childcare provision or maybe can't afford it. So I'm afraid I'm all in favour of the state providing basic childcare facilities for young children. I remember visiting friends in Denmark many years ago and being taken along to the children's nursery where they could be, the children could be placed by their parents from a very early hour in the morning. And of course, all the furniture was beautiful pine Scandinavian furniture. It was all, every possible toy under the sun. It was wonderful. And that carries over also into schools. I'm all in favour of things like free school meals. Now, the reason that I say that is because when you have a child arriving in school, either hungry or tired, there is very little you can do. And I'm all in favour of schools doing a little bit of a lift for children in terms of providing them with meals if they're not currently being provided with proper meals at home, and making sure that they get off to a good start to their day. And in the same way, not all children are looked after equally well. I think if we can provide basic universal childcare facilities, which offer that sort of minimum for young children, particularly with today's emphasis on outdoor play and so on, I think we're helping people. Now, of course, there's a cost to that. There's always a cost to this sort of provision. But I'm afraid that personally, probably because I'm an ex-teacher, I have a prejudice in trying to do all we can in those early formative years. Thanks, Donald.
John, don't feel you have to comment on that question if you
Yeah, no, I would like to. You know, childcare is a key growth sector in Scottish Labour's view, and some of our youngest kids have now only known a world of lockdown, and we need to get proper socialisation back in place to give them the best start in life. You know, I agree with Jamie here. The SNP took their eye off the ball, and the families who voted for the SNP based on their child care pledges at the last election might even have kids as old as 7-year-old and are still waiting. So, you know, the promise of 1140 hours was never on target before COVID hit. And, you know, you're still waiting for that to be implemented. Scottish Labour support flexible, all age, all year, wraparound, affordable care. And we also need to see that expansion of hours continue. So, you know, I think we also need to look at the workforce here, expand our workforce and provide more opportunities for the sector. It's a highly skilled sector, the majority of which are women, so we need to increase standards and pay in the sector as well. So that's why we need to focus on a community recovery in the next Parliament, and childcare plays a key part in that to allow people to get back to work and to give our kids the best start in life. So absolutely, Scottish Labour is focused on delivering the best childcare we can in the next Parliament and reversing the failures of the 1140 and SNP's failure to implement that in the last term.
Great, thanks for that, John. So we'll now move on to a different area. One question only on this topic. Would you vote to repeal the hate crime bill? So I'm sure all our audience tonight are familiar with the hate crime bill. It took up a lot of column inches, a lot of media over the past few months. Jamie.
Yes. I mean, you know, I could give you a very long answer, but yes, we would. We don't think it criminalizes behavior in the home. You know, we all accept and we all recognize the real issues around you know, hate in this country and some of the things that are being said online and being said in public and the like, and we all want to counter that. But the hate crime bill, which we raised issues with all the way through the process, we tried to make sure that we could improve it. We could try to deal with the issues, the concerns that we have. But unfortunately, what we've got is a very bad piece of legislation, and there are real concerns about some of the areas of criminalisation, and also the way, again, it treats women. It doesn't include women, which is a fundamental flaw. It is a bad piece of legislation. It pushed through. I'm disappointed that other parties backed it. We would repeal it.
Actually, if I could add to that question, there's another question that's come in which has received quite a few votes, which is that question is, why are some people in society worthy of protecting from hate crimes and others not?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is like, I think, a very fundamental issue that you know, we set up within that legislation certain groups. Now, you know, it's quite understandable. There are groups that will be the victims, you know, and this is not just related to the hate crime. There are particular groups that we do look to protect or increase protections to because of perhaps the nature of their job or the nature of the crimes that happen against them. But as I say, the fundamental issues with the hate crime bill is that it's been poorly thought out, poorly put forward. You know, there has been a huge amount of discussion about it, but it's one that I think, you know, out with a small bubble in Parliament, it is almost entirely discredited. I can't tell you the amount of concerned correspondence I've had on it, and I was very pleased when we voted against it. And as I say, as a Scottish Conservative government, would repeal it.
Thanks, Jimmy. Kate, keen to get your views.
Yeah.
Would you vote against the hate crime bill? And why are some people worthy of protection and others not?
Well, so hate crime already exists in relation to certain minorities. So we have already chosen 20 years ago, 30 years ago now, to put in place hate crime legislation against racism, for example. And you ask any disabled person probably in Scotland and they will tell you that they have been subject to hate crime. You ask the Jewish community in Scotland and they will tell you that they've been subject to hate crime. You ask some Christians and I'm pretty sure they'll tell you that they feel they've been subject to hate crime. So, we don't live in a happy world where everybody treats each other with respect. And whilst legislation has been in place on hate crime for at least 30, if not 40 years, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, I think it's important that we do protect minorities. And Christians regularly tell me that they're worried about some of their freedoms. The difficulty, of course, is with all of that is to make sure that we protect freedom of speech at the same time. Now, a number of Christians approached me very early on with some concerns about the hate crime bill. And I think pretty much all of those concerns were resolved in extensive meetings with the Cabinet Secretary because he took those concerns on board. So, for example, very early on, there were concerns about Section 5 around inflammatory materials. We went to speak to him. He removed that section completely. There was a request about a general freedom of expression clause going in order to strengthen the rights of freedom of speech. And that was included with cross-party support. So Jamie's party supported that general freedom of expression bill. And one of Jamie's colleagues also allowed a clause to go forward to ensure that offence could be given to ensure that the freedoms of expression were as strong as possible. So, I understand, because I get the emails as well, the concerns that have been raised. I don't think anybody would dispute, particularly those Christians and church ministers that were with me in those meetings with the Cabinet Secretary. I don't think anybody would dispute that he didn't move substantially. And I think there's certainly a letter from the Christian Institute that backs up that point, moved substantially. And we come back to that position. Hate crime in some form has existed for 40 years because, yes, we do believe that some minorities in Scotland deserve protection. We don't think racism is a good thing because we believe in the inherent worth of every human being. We don't think hate crime against disabled people is a good thing. Hate crime against religious minorities is not a good thing. So there's a balance to be struck. And I think the bill, which was subject to probably more scrutiny than any other bill this Parliament, saw substantial changes in direct response to concerns that Christians raised.
Thanks, Kate. And Denis, if we could get your views on that, would you vote against the hate crime bill, and why are some groups for protection against it?
My feeling that most laws which are enacted by democratically elected governments are normally allowed to stand and then be tested in the sort of crucible of public debate and also occasionally in the courts. So I would not move to repeal a hate crime bill right away. As Kate has outlined, unfortunately, despite all our sort of wishes and endeavours, there are some groups which historically have been marginalised and damaged by that process of being marginalised, and perhaps stand in need of more protection than some other groups. I do take the point, which you could make quite readily, that we should all be treated exactly the same. But unfortunately, history shows us that we haven't always treated people exactly the same, even in our own quite recent past. You only have to look at the treatment of some of our minorities. You only have to think about how recent things like the Windrush scandal were to realize that we don't always treat people equally. And I don't personally have any problem with offering special protections to people who historically have shown to be suffering and therefore perhaps in need of special protection. So no, I wouldn't be prepared to repeal it right away. What I would expect, though, is that as time goes on, all the difficult issues which you have raised and which have been raised by those constituent letters to Kate and Jamie and so on will become tested. And they'll become tested in the courts, which is the place that they should be tested. And then perhaps if people don't feel comfortable with how the hate crime bill is working, then they can look at it again. And I have to say that all laws are subject to this process. When David Steele introduced the Abortion Act back in whenever it was, 1967, he never thought that it might be the case that one day in the future, people would perhaps use or claim a right to abortion for gender-specific reasons, which to me, and probably to anybody who'd ever thought about supporting the bill in the first place, seems absolutely horrendous. He could never have anticipated that. Society has changed radically in the meantime. And I suspect that society will continue to change. And it may be in the future that if people are not happy with the bill as it currently stands, we will use the democratic process to either amend or change or repeal it as and if it seemed to lack suitability for modern society. So I think we have to grasp with the fact that we haven't always treated minority groups well. We want to treat them well. Sometimes they need protection. That process evolves over time. Social mores and habits evolve. We recognize that, and hopefully we can improve ourselves. And my ideal, of course, is the fewer laws, the better. Generally, I'm not in favor of new laws if we can devise other ways of improving our society. Thank you, Donald.
Great, thanks, Denis. And John, keen to get your views. Would you vote against? Would you vote to repeal the hate crime bill? And do you believe that certain groups should be protected while others not?
Thanks, Donald. No, I mean, I wouldn't vote to repeal it. I do think it is flawed legislation. And I think that's been the hallmark of the Scottish Government over the past term. We've seen legislation come forward that is particularly weak and ill thought out on occasion and time again. And I think the hate crime bill exemplified that. You look at the flaws with it. Labour thought it was flawed because it didn't include sex as a protected characteristic. However, as Denis and Kate have said, we have to recognise that ultimately this bill is in place to give protection to minorities. I think in modern Scotland, it's right that we sought to consolidate, modernise and reform Scotland's hate crime laws. And we need this bill because hate crime has become more widespread. I mean, you see the hate on Scotland's streets due to, our Asian communities have suffered throughout the pandemic. And I think Scottish society has become more polarised and more divided over the past decade. So hate crime exists, racism exists in Scotland, and we did need to do something to tackle that. So the short answer is no, I wouldn't repeal it, although I do think it was deeply flawed legislation and could have been handled much better by the Parliament. And I actually think that's a good segue into why we need to reform the Scottish Parliament to actually make sure that the legislation we pass is better, it's more effective, and opposition parties have more power to hold the government to account. Because time and time again, we see legislation being railroaded through, perhaps the use of amendments at stage 3, which haven't been properly debated or had the chance to be properly scrutinised at earlier stages. So I do think the way the Parliament is working at the moment isn't fit for purpose. So fundamentally, Scottish Labour want to look at how the Parliament operates, bring it up to date, because currently it's not working as we hoped it would. And I think the hate crime bill is a perfect example of that.
Thanks, John. We have just over 15 minutes left, and I'm keen to fit in a couple of big topics. So maybe ask you to give slightly briefer answers to these next couple of questions. So a lot of questions about the EU. So I think some ballpark statistics. I think I'm right in saying that about 20% of Scotland's exports go to the EU, 60% go to the rest of the UK, and 20% go to the rest of the world. Ballpark numbers. So, Kate, if I could put this question to you first. It says the SNP are mourning the severance of our links with the EU. However, Scotland's links with Westminster seem to be shackles from which they are eager to free us. So can you clarify your policy on the EU, please?
Sure. Usually in Hustings, the Constitution is one of the hardest questions, but after that hour, it's probably quite nice to answer some questions about the Constitution. So I guess I'd approach this by saying the fundamental difference between the United Kingdom and the EU would be, and I will get onto the specifics, is that ultimately there are choices facing countries within the EU about what powers they give up, what powers they choose to keep, We saw that with the UK's membership of the EU. There were some things that they accepted and took on board, and there are other things they didn't. They weren't part of the Eurozone, for example. And that is not a choice that's open to us as a country within the UK. So in the event of independence gives us the powers and the ability, which we don't have right now, to strike a new relationship with the rest of the UK. Now, I do not want to, and perhaps you'll scoff at this, I don't want to create new hard borders. I am somebody who would like to have a very close relationship with our closest allies in the rest of the UK. I do not want hard borders. I want us to be able to trade. But I also believe in democracy. And right now, if you look at some of Scotland's biggest growth industries, whether that's food and drink, watching some of that rotting on the side of the Channel. If you talk to some small businesses in the Highlands who are exporting to the EU, all of this panel were on a hustings last week where we heard directly from a small business who is really struggling and is thinking of closing their retail store because they cannot export to the same extent in a rural part of the Highlands. So Brexit's had a big impact. Perhaps that would be understandable if we could say that a majority of people in Scotland had voted for it, but they didn't. Yes, people voted for Brexit, and I don't denigrate that choice, but ultimately, Scotland voted by a majority to remain, and yet our businesses are still lumbered with the consequences of that. So I think there's great opportunities for Scotland to have close trading relationships with the rest of the UK, as well as having very much closer relationships with the huge market in the EU.
That's great. Jamie, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Well, there's a lot in there, isn't there? And I know you've asked for very brief responses, but I mean, there's no doubt there are challenges with Brexit. I think we all accept that. I'm the rural economy spokesman for the party, and obviously been dealing with this in terms of some of the issues around groupage and getting exports abroad, which are improving and have improved by governments and exporters and the producers all working together. But there's no doubt it was a difficult time because a deal was agreed, which everybody I think wanted. A deal was agreed relatively last minute, a deal that I might point out was voted against by I think all other parties within the Scottish Parliament, which was a remarkable situation. I mean, the difficulty is we've just come through a pandemic. Now we're agitating another independence, or the SNP are agitating for another independence referendum only 7 years after we said no. And a lot of the arguments that are being used, and particularly around Brexit, are false ones. In 2030, we knew that there was going to be, or there was a likelihood there was going to be an EU referendum. Scotland voted to remain in the EU and be part of that joint decision making. The referendum happened. I voted to remain within the EU, but I respect that the side back lost, and unfortunately, the SNP never seemed to do that. And the contradictory position of we want to leave one union to because we were forced to leave another one, particularly when the one you're now looking to leave is far more important. And the fundamental, as I say, issue here is that we simply don't know when, if I say an independent Scotland would ever get back into the EU, because it doesn't meet the criteria. And Kate, as Finance Secretary, knows that better than anybody else. And we don't know whether we'd have to have a hard border with England. We don't know whether we'd have to have the euro as a currency. That's what new members do. So it would be extremely damaging for us to be to it, and it would put barriers between us and our biggest market. And as I say, it's completely contradictory position to be taken. Unionists for the European Union, but nationalists against England. So, I think what we need, and I think what majority of people in Scotland will vote for at this next election, will be for us to basically work with the rest of the UK, go forward, build our relationship with the EU, as I think we all want to do, but not go through yet more constitutional navel gazing and constitutional wrangling, because it doesn't benefit anybody.
John, would you like to come in next, please?
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, I mean, look, the Conservatives and the SNP clearly want to go back to the old arguments about division and about Brexit and leave or remain, or yes or no. We've just come through one of the most damaging economic events of all our lifetimes. And what we need the next Parliament to focus on is a recovery that gets us back on our feet, gets people back into jobs, gets our education and hospitals back to where they should be, not going back to the divisive arguments of the past. Now, I'm a passionate European. I voted to stay in Europe, and I'm gutted that we ended up leaving. But we need to focus in the next Parliament on that economic recovery. The Highlands and Islands in particular have been worse hit than the other parts of Scotland and the UK. And our recovery from the pandemic is going to take longer due to the effects of both Brexit and COVID. So let's not go back to those old arguments of the past. Let's go forward with a national recovery plan that works for our communities. I could go on, I'm conscious of time, but Kate absolutely was making the point, and Jamie's made it as well. Would we have the criteria? Would we meet the EU criteria to get back into the EU as an independent state? It's not clear to me. Even if we did, it would most likely lead to a hard border with England, our next biggest trading partner. And we've already seen the damaging impacts of Brexit on Scotland's economy. So Scottish Labour are clear. We don't want to see a referendum, a second referendum, and we want the Parliament, the next Parliament, to focus on recovery, not division.
Denis, if we could get a brief answer from you also, please.
Thank you, Donald. I mean, after Jamie's candour, I suppose I should follow. I too, Jamie, voted to remain, not because I was particularly in favour of the European Economic Community, because I've always regarded it as something of a sort of corporate club, but I have actually lived in Europe for a long time. I'm fond of Europe. I have never had any difficulty with having the closest possible relationship with Europe. The real reason I voted to remain was I thought, I'm an oldie, the young ones will face an economic hit. But having had the referendum, I, unlike other parties, accepted the result. I did feel that you have to recognise the result of the referendum, and Scotland did decide to remain as part of the UK. So I've accepted that result, even if it put me at odds with some of my own party. On the question of the practical effects of Brexit, yes, we're facing some temporary disruption. I'm hoping it's going to be temporary. And the reason I say that is that an economic fact, which is often pointed out to me, is that the growth rates of other parts of the world are far higher than those maintained by the EU. So although I think we will have substantial short-term economic disruption, I don't have any doubt that in the long term we can make it work. But equally well, what I want to make work is our good relationship with the European Union. They are our closest neighbours physically. We want things to work, and it's in their interest that it works as well, because the disruption we're suffering in terms of it being able to export fish and other things is also being felt by Europeans, the Netherlands, places like that. They're really suffering. So it's in all our interests to make that relationship work. Thanks, Donald.
Get myself off mute. Right, just struggled to get myself off mute there. Sorry, so we've got two questions and we have about 6 or 7 minutes. So if you give really brief answer to these two questions, please. The first question, and this question has received more votes than any other question this evening. And John, I'll start with you. What has been your party's biggest error in the past 12 to 18 months?
Thanks, Donald. This question actually came up at the Skye Hustings the other day, and I'll hold my hands up and say I didn't give my best answer there, and I've gone away and reflected on it. And, undoubtedly for Labour, it was the anti-Semitism issue that our party faced under Jeremy Corbyn. I found it abhorrent, and I found it just utterly disappointing that our party was having to debate this issue in the 21st century. I'm glad now that Keir Starmer has come in and we've taken steps to stamp out the issue. But I think it was a shameful period for the Labour Party. And I hope we never go back to those days. There's absolutely no space for anti-Semitism within the Labour movement. There's no space for anti-Semitism within politics, full stop. And I think the fact that we had to discuss it again was deeply shameful, and the Labour Party needs to hold its hands up and make the changes necessary to stamp that out within the party. So certainly we're making progress, but that has to be our biggest failing over the last 12 to 18 months.
John, thanks for that. Denis, if I go to you next, please.
Thanks. Two things. One that we got punished for at the polls in December 2019 was going against the result of the referendum. I think the voters punished us on that one. They felt that we should have accepted the result of the referendum on Europe. The second one, which I think is perhaps more a sort of one particular to our party, is that we're not good at explaining things like federalism. We really haven't managed to get our message across to people in words that they understand, that essentially what we want is a sort of four-nation UK. I'm still struggling with it. That's an ongoing issue. Thank you, Donald.
Great, thanks. Kate?
Thanks. If I had to choose one, and not give more than one, I think the biggest one was probably, there's been several in terms of COVID related matters, but if I could hone in on the exams of last summer, because I think young people in particular have been through a hugely stressful year, and on top of that, the constant changing when it comes to exams, and also the fact that exam results were based not just solely on teachers' grades, but also the infamous algorithms. I think this whole period in the last year has been a very humbling one, because politicians have made mistakes and they've put their hands up and admitted to making mistakes, which is good, and probably politicians should do that more often. But certainly the exams one is one that we accepted we got wrong, and it caused huge amounts of worry and distress to young people who were awaiting exam results to get into university or to pick another subject.
Thanks, Kate. And Jamie?
It's a rather unfair way of doing this, I suppose, because actually you could have asked me to find Kate's ones, and she's probably done the same for me and for the Conservative Party. I mean, it is difficult when you're in government, because I think you do make mistakes, and you have to own up to them where they are. Obviously, we're opposition in Scotland. I think one of the areas, perhaps, and this is the one that I put forward at the Skye Hustings, and I think I would stand by, although it's not really 12 to 18 months, I think has been not making more cases for the union more strongly all the way through, because it's not just a constitutional wrangle. It is genuinely what government focus, unfortunately, has been focused on, and what the Parliament therefore has focused on. And we know the benefits of of being part of the UK. We've seen things like obviously the vaccination programme, which has been so successful. We've seen furloughing, but I think that case hasn't been made, and I would like to have seen that case being made directly in Scotland by people like Rishi Sunak, who's played such a massive role, Matt Hancock and Nadim Zawi, in terms of the vaccine rollout. So I think identifying probably the support and the effort of the UK government and the UK armed forces and etc. in helping with the pandemic has probably been a failure in itself, although it's a failure to highlight the great successes I think that were happening.
Great, thanks, Jamie. So one final question. Now we have 3 minutes left, so I really want a brief answer, and I want a very direct answer. Don't want any sitting on the fence on this question. So if I start with Denis, I'd like you all to answer this question definitively. If you could have excelled in a sporting career of your choice, which sport would you have chosen?
Rugby.
Thank you. Kate?
Probably tennis.
Tennis.
Because I've always failed to be able to hit the ball.
Okay. I should play you sometime. John?
It would be basketball. I was on the Dingwall Academy basketball team bench. Never called up, probably due to my height, which at 5'6", it doesn't lend itself very well to the sport, but I do enjoy it.
One of these days. Jamie?
Well, I don't want to brag, and people may not believe this, given that COVID and the pandemic has been unkind to me, but I was actually club captain of the national hockey champions a few years back, albeit that club captain is a non-playing position. I'm not sure I can particularly claim it, but I've been involved in sport for all my life. I would love to have been a better rugby player. My great-great-uncle was one of the first ever Scotland international rugby players. I'd have loved to have been that good. So I think I'll put down rugby as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, we all know a little bit more about each of you now. So we have to draw matters to a close. I'd like to thank the panel for their time, for the good-natured debate. I'd like to thank everyone who attended for your time, for your questions, and let's all exercise our democratic freedoms and ensure that we vote in this election. So thank you.